All right, so first up, we're going to have Craig Sumner and James Lawson. They're going to guide you through a solutioning session, how to kind of think about projects, how to think about processes, and show you a little bit about a little bit of the software with a couple of demos. So, James, Craig.
Thank you, Kyle. So the focus of this presentation will really be around how do you design a solution where you want to use our software. So if you think about the life cycle of automating your processes, the very first stage is about building a book of work, building a pipeline of different opportunities you want to automate. Later on in the process, you need some developers, and they're going to estimate how long it's going to take to implement that automation, and they're then going to implement it. But in the middle, somebody has to come up with the requirements. Somebody has to come up with a view of what that solution is at a high level. And so that's really the focus for today. And we're focusing on how to do that for RPA 2.0. We're then going to go into some case studies, solution on some specific real-world examples to kind of bring the theory to life. And then there's going to be a panel discussion. We're going to bring on a few more colleagues and open it up to questions. So I think everybody here has some familiarity with robotic process automation. The vast majority of the room have at least done some POCs, if not started to scale. And the rules for RPA 1.0 are really quite simple. They're well known. Everybody has their template and their formulas. The common things that people are always looking for are structured data, simple rules-based processes where you can map out the logic, yes or no, left or right, one or two, and then from there, you're easily able to automate. And we're also looking for opportunities that are very, very digital. So that's what RPA 1.0 is. Everybody has a way of trying to work out what those use cases are and generally don't find it that difficult. So I think the challenge with RPA 1.0 that you will frequently come across is, what about unstructured data? Because the second that data is unstructured, you can no longer use simple rules to automate it. What about processes where some judgment is required, where somebody needs to pause and think and make a decision? Should I accept or reject this payment? Is it potentially fraudulent? This email, who should I send this on to? When it's judgment-based, RPA 1.0 starts to struggle. And then one other major limitation when you're thinking about what RPA 1.0 is non-digital data. So if it's not digitized, how are you going to get it into your systems, and how are the rules-based bots going to be able to manage that data? So what we're going to talk about is the various different capabilities in our product that you heard about yesterday, and how those can be used to automate an end-to-end process. The advantage of RPA 2.0 is you're getting all the capabilities you need in a single platform to automate more complex processes, those that have unstructured data, those that aren't entirely digitized, and those that do require judgment work. So we're still using RPA, we're still using rules-based automation, particularly for those simple steps in the process to fetch data, to do copy and paste tasks, what we sometimes call handwork. So just somebody at their computer typing away. But there are other capabilities you need as well. So you have OCR, which is an intelligent way of digitizing your documents, digitizing your data. And that means you can take in data from any source and any language. Makes you much more flexible, because in many processes, people still want to send in letters. People still want to send in emails and interact with you. And in many situations, you can't move all your suppliers or all of your customers onto a standardized form. AI is obviously then the really important capability that enables you to interpret this information that's coming in, no matter what the format or the source, and be able to do this judgment work. So where the thinking is required, where the head work is required, if you want to try and automate a whole complex end-to-end process or a whole role, then AI becomes really important. The next thing you need to be thinking about is workflow. So how are you going to seamlessly transfer work and data between your people, your staff, your rules-based automation, your rules-based RPA, and any AI? How are you going to transfer work between them? How are you going to manage exceptions? How are you going to make sure that there are the right updates to the right teams? And so that's where workflow becomes really important. And then finally, analytics. So across this entire process, is it traceable? Do you understand what different people are doing? Do you understand what your bots are doing? Are you able to make sure that you're hitting your KPIs? Are you meeting your SLAs? So if you have those different capabilities, you can automate much more complex end-to-end processes. So for each of those different elements, you need to be thinking about how you're going to build up your solution. And what Craig is going to do now is just take you through by each capability what you should be looking for.
Excellent, thanks James. So as James mentioned before, there's various different data types that we can handle based on the different technology levers that we decide to pull on an intelligent automation platform like WorkFusion SPA. RPA, as we've discussed, is very straightforward, but we're very restricted by the type of data that we can handle. So it's got to be structured, it's got to be rules-based, and it's got to be digital. OCR gives us the ability to convert images and documents into unstructured digital data. AI can be used to help us handle that unstructured data, and as James just mentioned, workflow and analytics allow us to really operationalize those capabilities and extend the value across much broader scope of processes. So when we talk about RPA, it's really, really important that we go down to the keystroke level on our requirements. This is, as it says on the tin, what keys are we pressing, where's the data going, what decisions are being made, can we map out all of the logic, and importantly for WorkFusion is this going to be a UI automation, so do I need a desktop application, or is this something that I can do via an API call? Okay. So unlike traditional RPA vendors, we aren't just restricted to executing on a VDI with a user interface. We can do API calls at a server. So we need to go into the detail about what kind of data we have available, where it needs to go, and map out the system interactions and the type of transactions that need to be committed to those systems and automate in the most appropriate way. With OCR, we're looking at document level requirements. For OCR, there are various constraints around the quality of those documents, the quality of the image, to enable us to extract data successfully from those document sources. So as a rough guide here, we have 300 DPI or higher, which is the quality of the printed image. We need machine type text. OCR is very limited in terms of digitizing long prose in freehand handwriting, so that can be a challenge. We need unobstructed print. What this means is if I have a very complex document that's got highlights or stamps across it, we need to understand what those different colors are and how we could potentially look past those obstructions to still successfully extract the text behind them. And then obviously the font size. If the font size is too small, when the image becomes digitized, the text is often overlapping because the fonts are so close to each other. So we need to make sure that we have these minimum requirements to successfully extract the data from those documents. When we move on to AI, it's feature level requirements. So what features am I trying to extract, classify, decide on, categorize, okay? And we need defined inputs to our process. So what we mean by this is we're not restricting, if we use document data extraction, for example, we're not restricting the number of document formats we want to extract, but we need to define which fields we want to extract from those documents. And the documents that we're putting through our machine learning algorithm need to have those fields present. If those fields aren't present in some of our sample, then they need to be handled differently. We need to define number of outputs. Again, where is this data going? How are we going to extract it? What buckets or classes are we going to create to channel different items into, depending on what kind of model we're building. And then we need to have data available. So if there isn't sufficient training data, we're not going to be able to build an efficient and accurate machine learning model. And we also need to define what our expected outcomes are. So we need to have a good understanding of what success is, what a true positive is, and or a false positive, or a true negative for the outcomes of our machine learning models. For workflow, we need to go into a task level requirement. So what is it that my human user is going to be doing when they're handed a case? What is the trigger and the endpoint of this human task? What requirements do I need of my human user? Are they making a decision? Are they signing something off? Are they checking a process? Are they making or adding details to something that one of my bots has done further downstream? What decision points and validations do I need to include in this particular task? And what happens afterwards? Where does this get routed? Is there further automation downstream? Is there a target application that this information is going into? And then based on those things, what skills, roles, and qualifications do I need from my human workers to make sure they can do this task accurately? If I'm asking them to do some knowledge work, which is going to be used to train a machine learning model, I need the right people to do this job. The data that they help us extract from the documents needs to be accurate, otherwise our machine learning model is not going to be accurate, as a good example, okay? And then analytics, just to finish off on this part, we need to understand the data that we're collecting that's coming from our processes, and we need to know what format you want to see. Is this a graph? Is it a report? What frequency and schedule is this reporting going to be done on, and who's the target audience? What level of granularity do we need to go into? Is this for analytics on an individual process, an individual bot? Okay, extraction rate from an individual field on one document, for example. That would help us build and understand the requirements for those reports, okay? And there are some general rules of thumb that we can apply to all of the processes that we're looking at, all the processes we're looking to automate within our intelligent automation capability. And these are fairly standard. We should be looking at the process itself. Is it stable and mature? If a process is not stable and not mature, then the requirements could change. Okay. Governance, do we have a clear owner? Do we have clear responsibility and buy-in from just the key stakeholders on this or of the process to automate this? And are the SMEs going to be available to help us do the activities that we've just explained? Even requirements gathering, training machine learning models without the SME availability, we're not going to have success on automating this process. In terms of IT, classic things like target systems being available. Is there any need to operate outside of supported hours? And will we be able to get user access, credentials, all of the security requirements that are needed for us to run an automation on those applications? And in terms of benefits, what is it that we're going to achieve by automating this business process? Is it real? Can it be realized? And is it measurable? So we need to make sure that all of these things are true before we take a process forward into delivery. I'm going to hand back to James now, who's going to talk about the application of this theory in practice.
Yeah, so I think in practice you'll have done some book of work development, but often there are cases where you've done that at a very high level, or perhaps you haven't done it at all. So in practice, when you want to go through this exercise, the very first thing that we typically use, and I highly recommend this as an approach, is to have some form of questionnaire that you're comfortable with, where you've listed out the requirements you think are particularly important. We have a questionnaire that we can share, but you can also develop your own customized to what you've learned and what's important to your business. And by having this questionnaire, you can send it out to different teams who have identified an opportunity to automate. Because at that stage, it's just an opportunity. And until we've gathered enough information to come up with that solution along the lines Craig just explained, we can't be certain if it's worth taking further, whether or not it's feasible, and ultimately what are the benefits going to be. And so in this questionnaire, you'll cover a wide range of things, but I think you can really break it down into three main buckets. So you've got questions that are around the business requirements, questions about the systems that are being used, and questions around the data. So the business questions are just really useful to get a good context understanding of the process. So could they give you a quick overview of what the process is in 5 to 6 sentences? What is the main pain point? Why are they looking at automation? And are there other problems that we need to be aware of when we're building this automation? What are the sort of goals and success criteria? You really need to define those early so that when you implement, you understand whether or not you've succeeded or not. How big is the team size? Where are they based? All of these sorts of factors then help you to build out the business case. So how many FTEs are involved and how much time are they spending on this process? Then when you're thinking about system questions, these are really, really useful, particularly around the RPA side of things. So how many systems are involved? How complex are they? Are they web-based systems? Are they old legacy applications and terminals? So where are you going to get your data from in different bits of the process? Also, how complex is it to log into those systems? Do you have the credentials, for example? And then in terms of the data questions, this is really important, particularly as we think about the AI side of things, but also fundamental just if you want to do a simple RPA process, because you need to know where the data is going to come from, where the data is going to go, what type of information you want to get out of it. And so when we look at some of the demos later and apply this in practice, you'll see a few different examples of where this is really important. How much volume of data have you got going through the process? Because as Craig mentioned earlier, you need some training data if you want AI. And that training data could either be historic data, it could be the data from the last week or month or year, or it could be that there's so much data flowing through this process, you can just use yesterday's data, and that will be sufficient. Because you don't need that many examples to start training a machine learning model. You're only looking at 100, 500, maybe 1,000 to start really getting a good model. And then I think a few other elements, so how sensitive is this data? Because that might affect what deployment option you use. Do you want to host it in the cloud, or do you want it within your infrastructure on premise? And with WorkFusion, both options are available. And then you've got this questionnaire, they've filled it in, but you've never done this process before. So you're reading through this questionnaire and you're going to have a lot of questions, and it's not sufficient for you to then build a solution. So at this point, it's really, really useful to involve a subject matter expert from the process. It's really, really useful to have a conversation with them, interview them, do a workshop, see some videos potentially, any number or blend of those different types of tools and techniques. And what you want to do is be able to map out the process at a high level in 5 to 10 boxes and really understand what they're trying to achieve. And what you're looking for is, are there exceptions that we need to be worrying about? Or is there just a simple happy path that covers the vast majority of the process? The data samples that they sent you when they did the questionnaire, are those representative, or and how much do they vary? Are these samples you sent in English really what the process is like? Or are there also lots of documents in Spanish, French, Italian, because that might then change how you do the development? Are all the subjective decision points being captured? So if you think about a really simple RPA process, the reason why there are often exceptions and often challenges if you don't have the AI capabilities is because people didn't think about all the points when you need to do something subjectively or really interpret something quite complex. Is OCR required? So as we were saying, there's that full stack of capabilities. Which ones are you going to need in this process? Is it just going to be RPA, or is it going to be a combination of RPA, OCR, and AI? And you'll see in our case studies that most complex end-to-end processes need a range of these capabilities to be automated. I think a good piece of advice in general is to always ask why. At every point in the process, why are you doing this? And to drill down into as much detail as possible. Those from the kind of Lean Six Sigma world will be familiar with the 5 whys, where you just keep asking why, almost like a child, until you get to the real answer that you want to find. So I think with those, thinking about those different techniques, and by talking to the subject matter experts, the people who actually do the process day to day, you'll get a much better understanding of whether or not it can be automated and how to automate it as effectively as possible to deliver the maximum returns on investment. And then finally, so you've come up with a solution, you think you know how to crack it, but at this point, there are a few final words of advice I'd share. Firstly, set success criteria. Make sure that these are really clear and objective success criteria. People say, well, is it automated or not? Is the simple success criteria, but there's more to it behind that. So what percentage of the process is automated? How quickly is it running? These are other considerations that people do generally have a preference for, but won't necessarily share unless you ask for it. The next bit is to actually document your solution. So even if you're doing an agile implementation, I think it is important to have some documentation up front for that backlog of work, so that it's very clear what you're developing, and so that your developers, the people who are then going to have to do a detailed estimate, are very comfortable with what they have to do and able to actually implement what you're promising. At that point, when you've got a good solution documented and the stakeholders are happy, you can then share it with the developers. They can come up with an estimate, and a more formal estimate than the high-level one you did when you were building your book of work. So when you're building your book of work, you might have done a rough estimate. You might have said, well, it's going to be about 5 weeks, 6 weeks. A good developer will be able to tell you it's going to take me 22 days. if they've got experience using these tools. And then that makes it much easier to plan and manage stakeholder expectations. And then the final point is obviously to try and get stakeholder approval. And generally, you're looking to get approval both from IT and the operational side. And if you've got that stakeholder approval, you're going to be in a much better situation. So I think what we'd like to do now is really bring this to life. We've talked a lot about fear, we've talked a lot about features and capabilities, and what we want to do is talk you through a few examples so that you can understand how this all works in practice, how Craig and I and others would be thinking about a process when somebody says, I want to automate this. So the first one I want to talk you through is accord forms. So these are, for those who aren't familiar with them, these are standard forms you get in the insurance industry. So these forms are very, very standard, and basically the objective of what the stakeholders are saying is that we don't want to process these anymore. We want to do this automatically. But at that point, when they say that, you don't necessarily know a huge amount about the problem, just that it sounds like the forms are standard. So at this point, you want to work out, well, where's the data coming from, and what are we going to do with that data? And when we looked at accord forms, we realized very quickly, well, these are standardized forms. In fact, the whole purpose of an accord form is basically in the 1970s, a number of insurers clubbed together with some non-profits and said, we're all filling out roughly the same paperwork with a load of different variations. Wouldn't it be great if we just had one form for each type of transaction, for each type of process? And so most insurers are using these forms most of the time for a lot of their processes. So we were able to see very quickly that for this process, those forms were quite structured. And you can see in the top right, and I'll show you in a second, a form that there's specific fields we want to extract. So then we need to identify what are those fields, and there's basically 6 or 7 that need to be extracted in this particular process. We then need to think about where we're going to get it from. So we're going to have these forms, but they potentially might need to be scanned, they might need to be digitized, and then what are we going to do with the output? So we've managed to extract these 7 fields. We're probably going to want to put that information somewhere, put it in the end system. So this is the process at a very high level. I've talked through the manual bit already, which is essentially, let's find this form, let's read this form, let's extract it, let's validate the data, finalize it, and then enter it into an application. So in the past, that was done entirely manually. There's no automation at all. And for us, the solution was a combination of different capabilities at each point. So we looked at how you'd retrieve a document, and basically that was possible to do with just RPA alone. So you were logging into the target application. It was a relatively simple application to work with, and you're able to go online as well, and it's all web-based. And all you're doing is just clicking through the application to download that form. We then realized, though, that you do need to use OCR. So these forms are images, they're PDFs, and as a result, before OCR, it's just an image. So we use OCR to digitize that document and make it something that's machine readable. Once we've then extracted that information, again, it's RPA, it's rules-based. The reason why it's rules-based and why we don't need AI, and this is a relatively simple case, is because the form is the same every single time. So you can say, look at the very top left of the page, and that's where you will get the carrier name, for example. And then finally, for this particular customer, this was a relatively early process for them. They wanted to make sure that there was still a human in the loop. And so that was an important part of the workflow. They wanted to make sure that before anything was entered into their downstream systems, that a person was able to review the answers. And so having validated the data with the RPA, we then hand it over to a person who's able to look through. And then finally, we're using RPA again to enter it into the systems. And so at each stage of that process, we've assessed what's required, matched it up to those capabilities, and made sure it was a good fit, as Craig was explaining earlier with the different capabilities. Okay. So I'll now just show you what that looks like on the software. So this is an accord form, and as you can see, it's very, very structured. So the agency is always going to be in the top left. The carrier is always going to be there. There are specific checkboxes, specific columns for where you want to put the values. And this form is the same for every single insurer, and for this particular case, it's the same form every single time. If the form were to be more varying, then we would be looking at AI, but this is a relatively simple process. And if I just show you what this looks like in the tool, apologies. you can see that we've essentially mapped it out on the workflow in a very, very similar way. So there's a start and there's an end. The first blue box and the other blue boxes, those are RPA. Those are simple rules-based automation, go into the system, then we feed it into the OCR engine, then we are able to extract the information using rules, validate it, and then if there's any concern around that validation, it can be passed on to a person. So there's automatic exception handling. And then finally, once we're content that we've got the right answers, we're able to enter it into the data store, and that's the end of the process. So that's a very simple example, primarily RPA. If we could touch back to the slides for a second. So I think now it'd be good to go into perhaps a slightly more complex example. That was pure RPA. So Craig's going to talk you through an anti-money laundering payment screening example that he's been working on.
Cool. Okay, so this case study is a little bit different. The business problem that we're trying to solve here is there's a team of guys in this particular bank who are retrospectively reviewing payment details of payments that have been submitted from other banks to their bank. And what they do is they trawl through this Excel spreadsheet, which has got something like 52 columns and hundreds of rows of data, and they're analyzing each field to try and work out whether or not a payment is legitimate or not. And there's several flags that they look for, whether or not it's the relationship between the beneficiary and the sender, or the type of payment, the country of origin, those sorts of things. But when we approached this challenge to start off with, it was unclear as to what fields that they were using to actually make the decision, and whether or not the decisions they were making were purely rules-based or subjective. So, for example, the relationship between the two entities, the sender and the beneficiary, for example, how easy is it to understand those relationships, and what are they using to inform that decision that they're making? We've also got an Excel spreadsheet, which a lot of RPA vendors would say to you, hey, yeah, we can automate Excel spreadsheets really easily. But when we go down into the field level detail of what's actually in this Excel spreadsheet, the data is completely unstructured, and the format changes even within the fields. So the sender, for example, or the beneficiary name might be a long string of numbers and letters. And if you're not familiar with the company name or the person's name, because some of these are individual people, it's very difficult to identify from that string of several digits and numbers and letters what's a name and what's not. So we broke this challenge down into several different tasks that the individual's trying to complete throughout the review. And then we decided that we would try and create a business process that was more efficient and effective than working in an Excel spreadsheet, but pulling, again, as we've discussed, pulling the appropriate technology levers for each step of that business process. So the way we decided to do this was, as you can see on this process flow, the human is retrieving the Excel file. They're doing this review and research simultaneously and making a judgment all at the same time. So when you sit with an SME, it's actually quite difficult to understand how to break this challenge down. But what we worked out was that they're actually looking at the entity names. So this is the sender and the receiver of the payment, and working out who that is. They're then working out whether or not it's an intercompany payment, a personal payment. So, me paying my father, or WorkFusion UK paying WorkFusion US, and then looking at the countries and typing up a small string of evidence that says this is WorkFusion US paying WorkFusion UK. It's not a problem. They then submit that evidence, and the file goes off after they finish their review. So we've broken this task down into several different chunks, and we're applying the appropriate technology for each step. So with the entity extraction, because there's a lot of unstructured data in that individual Excel file, we're using machine learning and training a model to find and identify the entity name within that field. The majority of the other components, like extracting the data of the payment, so the amount, the country, the type of payment, that's all rules-based. And we don't need to have human judgment on that particular part of the process, because if the field is there and the data is correct, we can use RPA to concatenate a description very quickly of saying company A has paid company B and it's this amount from this country. So what we've designed is a human task in WorkFusion Workspace, and all of these components are hidden from the end user. They no longer look at the Excel spreadsheet. We use RPA and machine learning to pull all of this data into a single view. We present the evidence to the human user for a review. Even the research that they used to do by going out to Google and searching for the company name is presented to them in this user interface. They can click into the different details if they want, and all of these options are available to them to review this transaction in seconds rather than minutes. They can update the details if the rules are wrong or if the machine learning model hasn't extracted the data correctly, and they can process these transactions much, much faster. But the key thing here is we're only using machine learning in a very small part of this process, but it's actually the most valuable bit, which is trying to understand the entity name from the complex unstructured data in that single Excel file field. And if they want to go into more details of the transaction, this was the other problem. The Excel spreadsheet is some 52 columns wide. If they want to see all of this data, they have to scroll across, try and make sure they don't lose the details. We've got an expanded section at the bottom of the task. If they want to investigate this further, if they want to pick up the phone and ask some questions, the details are available to them there. This is obviously a vanilla example because this is a real production use case and we can't share the customer data. But this gives you an example of that extraction from a company name. It's fairly obvious to a human the structure of this message, but for RPA, you would not be able to extract Heineken from this using rules because each entity name is a different number of digits, comes from different banks, so this format is always different. What we've done is we've trained a supervised machine learning model using 500 to 1,000 examples, and then using this data to pre-populate the task. But we still have the human user in the loop to do the review, do the quality control, and submit the use case once it's finished. But the key driver here was efficiency rather than automation. So we're making this task as efficient as we can using the appropriate technology levers to deliver the maximum benefits. Okay.
So we're going to go into one more case study, and with all of these case studies, feel free to approach us afterwards and we can talk through them in more detail. And also some of these examples may feature later in the day when we look at other tools and techniques and other elements of implementing them successfully. So I'm going to talk about mortgage insurance. For those who don't have mortgage insurance, it's pretty much what it says on the tin. So in some countries, it's quite common to get insurance on top of having a mortgage, basically making sure that if you don't pay up on time, that ultimately the bank that's giving you the mortgage is still going to get their money. So the objective here was basically making sure that every mortgage has a valid and current insurance policy in place. And so the scope of this process is trying to receive a vast number of different documents from insurers, sorting through the mail that's coming in, making sure that there's actually they actually have a valid policy, and trying to understand who the customer is. So it's quite a complex process to try and understand. The inputs are unstructured, highly unstructured, so you're just getting scanned documents coming in all sorts of different formats from different insurers. And the output we need is, first of all, to understand what type of document it is and whether or not it's relevant to this process and which bucket it falls into within insurance. And then to, if it's the right type, to be able to extract the right information and put it downstream. So immediately you can see that this is more complex than the Accord Forms example I was talking about earlier. The data is coming in a wide range of formats, and what we're having to do with that data is more complex. But at the start and the beginning, there's still a process of getting data and of inputting it into some systems. So it immediately sounds, without going into detail, like it's going to be a blend of rules-based automation, AI, and potentially some OCR as well. And that's probably the best way to solve this type of problem. But let's go into a bit more detail. So at a high level, the process is the document is retrieved by a person. They read through this documentation and they classify it into different buckets. They then will extract the policyholder information, match that with the customer database, and put that in, and then transmit that final data into the downstream system. So in terms of automating this, we need a blend of different technologies. Firstly, we're using RPA to connect to an inbox and using rules to extract the documents. We're then using OCR to digitize those documents because, as I said, they're just images and they come in a wide range of formats. And then in addition to that, we need to use some machine learning. And I'll show you on the software kind of the two types of machine learning tasks that are required. But the first is to actually classify the document. And then the second is to is to be able to extract the right information from that document. So two different things that a person is doing that a machine learning model is going to have to do as well. And then once all of that work is done, it's back to RPA, so we were able to take those answers, put them in the right system, and transmit them downstream. So if I'll now show you what this looks like on the software. So you can see, again, a process flow on the software with the same sort of start and end, different boxes to represent different stages, and behind each box there's the code. So we've got the blue boxes are the rules-based bit, like retrieving information and updating the core system. The gray box is the OCR, taking the image and converting it into digital text. And then we have two green boxes. So the first green box is being able to classify the mortgage insurance documents. So if I just show you what that looks like as a manual task. So as a manual task, somebody reads through the information on the left-hand side. They can see the original copy if they want, pre-digitization, and they just have to put it in one of these four buckets. So it's a simple click task, and that's how we would manage exceptions in the software, but it's also how we'd actually train it in the first place in many examples. So we would process these manually in the short term, and then the software would see the examples. It would see how a person is categorizing it, hence the supervised machine learning, learn from the people, and then in time we'll be able to automate this task. If I go back to the process, after you've classified those documents, you then need to extract the policyholder information. And so again, that's another machine learning task. And what you can see here is that document on the left-hand side. Again, you can see the original if you want. And then on the right-hand side, you've got the different fields. And so essentially what somebody does is they just highlight and tag the information. And so this is one that's already been highlighted. This has already been tagged by the software. So it said that Ryan is the principal borrower and Maureen is the secondary borrower. The property address is 415 Canterbury Way. And so by tagging this information when you're doing it with people, and in the long term, or not so long term, once you've built a machine learning model off, say, 500 examples of this, it's now able to do this task. And then once that task is completed, it's a simple case of using RPA to complete the rest of the process. And so I hope this kind of brings to life those capabilities we were talking earlier and what you're kind of looking for each stage. So you need the RPA for simple rules-based tasks. You need the OCR for digitizing documents, particularly when they're images or PDFs, and particularly ones that aren't currently machine readable. You need AI to deal with the more complex elements like categorizing these documents and extracting the right information. And then you're using RPA again to put it in the right target system. And then, as you saw yesterday, there's analytics across all of this and governance across all of this, which Carla's already amply covered, so I won't go into today. So that really summarizes the last process. And I think we'll soon move into the question and answer panel.
Yep, I think that's a good break. So what we're going to do now is a couple of our colleagues are going to join us on stage for a panel discussion on the solutioning topics that we've just talked about, and then we're going to open the floor to Q&A after that.
Microphone reason.
So hi everyone. I have the privilege of being on stage with our best solution consultants across APAC and Europe. Most of you or some of you may know them already. So we have Vijendra from our India practice. Of course, you know James and Craig already. I wanted to, we're going to do 3 questions and then we'd like to open the floor to you guys as well. First of all, I'd like maybe Beach to demystify a bit the theme of selecting a good use case. because it's not rocket science, right? It's not very complex. So Beach, could you explain to us what are the 3-4 key criteria you look at when you assess a use case for a customer?
Sure. Thanks, Adrian, first of all, asking for this question, because this is the first question we get at the, in fact, the first meeting itself, like how can you guys help us, figuring out some of the good use cases for automation. And as Adrian rightly pointed out, it's not a rocket science. So I would first like to start with, if the process is repetitive, it's not too subjective, like it does not require too much decision making, and it's like high volume, because of which a lot of your time is consumed, and a lot of low-level manual work is repetitively done. So to increase your productivity and efficiency, this directly helps you get quick gains. And of course, like WorkFusion has taken it to the next level, because you can definitely include unstructured data, which is very common in developing countries and in developed countries as well, especially coming from India and APAC region. We have a lot of unstructured data, which other vendors cannot handle gracefully, but we can do. So, with all these criteria, you can easily zero in at a handful of processes. That will be a quick start for automation journey.
Perfect, thanks, Bij. James, can you, maybe with your experience coming from, one of the leading consultants, explain to us what are maybe some mistakes that people do when they select use cases for WorkFusion?
Yeah, of course. So really good question, and I think it flows off nicely from Bajendra's answer. So it isn't that hard to identify a good use case, but there are a number of common mistakes people make. I think the worst and most glaring one that happens is people say, I want to automate X, but they don't actually understand the process as it is done manually today. And if you don't understand how the process works today, then good luck trying to automate it. I think the second mistake is, so if you don't understand your process, you're in a bad position, but also if you don't understand the capabilities. So if you haven't understood where RPA fits, where OCR fits, where AI fits, then you're going to, again, struggle to find a solution. And then I think the third mistake people make the most, which is perhaps at a slightly earlier stage, but around building a book of work, is prioritization. So for political reasons, or because some people are more enthusiastic than others, certain use cases will come up first. Sometimes those use cases are very small. There's very few FTEs involved. It's of low value. So why would you prioritize that case? In other examples, it is a good use case, but it's very big and complex. And so in that situation, you might want to break up the problem first, or to prioritize another use case that's got just as many FTEs, is just as important to the organization, but much, much easier. And so you can very easily plot your use cases by how much value will they deliver, what are the benefits, versus how easy are they to implement. And obviously, you want to focus on the ones that are high value and easy to implement first. Maybe do some of the really easy ones as quick wins, and then deprioritize some of the other ones that are perhaps too complex and too low value.
Thanks. Maybe one question for you, Craig, which is one that comes quite often from customers. How can you use WorkFusion to adapt a process if it changes, right? If my process is not stable, if I'm changing an application upstream, how can I use WorkFusion to not lose the benefit of what I've done and still continue automating the new one?
So change is a big topic. I think it touches on a lot of parts of the automation journey. And there are some capabilities of the tool that help us manage change, but it's really important to understand what that change is and how it's going to impact our operations and our automation journey in its entirety. I think the most important thing, going back to some of the slides that we discussed a few minutes ago, is really understanding the process, understanding how mature it is and how stable it is, how frequent this change is going to occur, and what kind of change it is, right? So if it's a change in the business rules and the requirements that underpin the entire end-to-end process, it doesn't matter whether you've got people doing it or you're trying to automate it, it's going to be very difficult to retrain, regather those requirements if the change is so frequent it's going to be very disruptive and impact your benefits. So it's important to understand that. And then in terms of system changes, how do we engage IT and the change management function of the business to be kept abreast of these changes? So is it a very simple change in the UI and some of the fields won't be affected? If I've used object-based automation, then these small UI changes might not impact my particular process. But if it's a target application that you have lots of automations on and they're all dependent on this target application and it's going to go down or be refreshed and have major structural changes, then we need to put a good, strong change management process in place to handle that and adapt our automations using WorkFusion Studio and update the objects in our WorkFusion Studio and roll that change out in a very similar way that you would with any other change management program across all of your automations. It's very easy to do that, and if you update one object in your library, that rollout is really very straightforward, but we need to be aware and educated about the kind of change that we're going to be experiencing. And then further to that, I think in terms of volumes, we have a lot of changes in our business in terms of seasonal demand, peaks and troughs in the data and volumes flowing through our processes. I think WorkFusion is uniquely positioned to handle that, where we have dynamic bots, where we can scale automatically, and we can use machine learning to handle the extra volume of unstructured data, new document formats that might come into our business process, and utilize the human-in-the-loop exception handling to route some of that work, some of the new scenarios that we might not have seen before, to a human user to make sure we capture that fallout. But the key principle here is that your automation capability in the organization is both a producer and a consumer of change. So without being keyed into the change management, business continuity planning, and disaster recovery functions of the organization, your automation capability will fail, your processes will keep falling over, and that's something that we need to be aware of when we start the journey, and obviously be very sentient of when we're gathering requirements so we can build that into our automations.
Thanks, Craig. Any question from the room? Yeah, we have one here. The mic is coming.
Hi. I was just wondering if you're able to expand on some of the machine learning algorithms that we use, particularly maybe James, that mortgage insurance use case. Could you be able to expand on the sort of algorithms that we use there instead of just having machine learning as a kind of topic?
Yeah, of course. So I don't know if you're around for yesterday, but the way WorkFusion selects a machine learning model is relatively simple. So we have a functionality called process auto machine learning. So what happens is you've got data input coming into the process, and then WorkFusion is seeing what people are doing, learning from them, and it's a form of supervised machine learning. And then at that point, WorkFusion will automatically select the right algorithm for the task. So there's a library of different algorithms that we've got, all of the best research from the places like MIT. We are basically productizing those. So we see that there's a good algorithm that's appropriate for, say, data extraction in documents. We will invest in getting that algorithm into our product. Then process auto machine learning is able to select from this library of different things. It might be random forest, it might be hidden Markov model. There's a range of different ones that are being used, and some are better at certain types of tasks like classification, others are better at other types of tasks like document extraction, maybe reconciling two data sets with fuzzy logic. So process auto machine learning does that selection bit for you. It then has a number of different feature extractors, as it's called in the machine learning industry. So if it's, say, looking at a document and it's trying to find a particular field, it's taking into about 48 different characteristics about just that individual field to work out if it's the right field or not. There are the obvious ones, like the position on the page, but there are other less obvious ones, like maybe the color of the field, whether it's bold or not, its proximity to other elements and other information, the nature of the field, whether it's a mixture of characters and numbers, and then having used that feature extractor, we're basically able to build a machine learning model automatically that can complete that task. And then finally, we can start giving work to the bot. The other important element is this continuous learning. So this isn't just based off an initial historic data set, but actually the bot continues to learn. And that kind of feeds into what Craig was saying around change management and change. There was a McKinsey study that looked at how often do you need to change AI models for different processes. And so having the software automatically choose the right model and having the software automatically continuously learn is really, really important in most industries and in any process that's quite complex where the data might suddenly change one day or the volumes might increase or you might onboard a new supplier or other customers. So that's how it does it automatically. On the machine learning SDK, you can also go in and tune the models. And if you have data scientists, then you can also bring those in and they can modify what's happening. But in general, WorkFusion is using machine learning models out of the box, and you don't need to know which one it's using. For the average audience and for the average use case, you just want to implement it quickly and easily. And I guess the whole mission of the company is to make automation easy and scalable so that you don't need to ask a question like which machine learning model it's using. But as Adam was saying yesterday, you just flick a switch and it's using the right one and training it appropriately and giving you the business return on investment you need.
I think it's important to mention also that the AutoML could pick different algorithms at different stages of a process, right? Because if you have 500 examples to learn, it's not the same if you have 5,000, and it's not the same if you have 50,000, right? So as your process goes live, you have more and more data coming, which means different sets, different ensembles of algorithms, you know, could play out differently and bring better results in different ways. So this retraining is exactly what the software is going to do, right? Challenge himself if you want and say, okay, I had a model V1. Is there anything else that could beat that? And if there's something that could beat it, then that would become the new reference, right? I hope that answers the question. If you want to zoom in, I think we're not going to lie. None of us are data scientists. So we know our threshold of competency. But you know, Kyle or Michael from our product team can tell you which algorithm in our experience have worked best through the AutoML selection for each different type of use case. Yeah? Yeah.
So this is a skill sets question. In your experience, what is the typical skill sets of a successful delivery team? And also as a follow-up, on an ongoing basis, what are the different skill sets that you see both in terms of operations as well as IT maintenance that an organization needs to contemplate? This is in the context of an organization which is really contemplating its first rollout. So it'll be useful to give us some first principles on that.
Sorry, could you just repeat the first part of the question? The scale size
Sure.
of your team?
What is the team composition?
Yes.
For an initial rollout?
Yeah. Happy to take this forward.
Yeah.
So you're going to want standard roles like a project manager and maybe a business analyst who understands the process and can help manage the project overall. So those are kind of standard roles. You can have whatever composition you like there, but typically we recommend one of each at minimum. In addition to that, you're going to want different types of skills to actually implement and develop these processes. So the three core roles that pop up the most that are of most interest are having an RPA developer, someone who's a bit more advanced, because whilst you can develop automations in the tool with a power user, with a business analyst, there may be some complex exceptions or something that does require a bit more developer background. So I think it's useful to have an RPA developer on the project. The second element that's useful is if it's machine learning, we have a role called a data analyst. It's not a particularly advanced data analyst, certainly not a data scientist. It's somebody who can attend our online course and very quickly brush up on the basics of statistics they learned when they were 15 but have long forgotten, and work out how it applies in the tool. So their role is to make sure that you're structuring things like those manual tasks I showed you in the demo earlier in the right way, and that the quality of the data feeding in is good. And then the third role is a machine learning engineer. So this is somebody who can tune the models and somebody who can go into that SDK and modify things, and also set up the task correctly to run through the auto machine learning engine. Again, that's something you can do for our Automation Academy. They also do some of the post-processing. So, for example, your data has come out, but then tweaking how it would go into the final system. So if you have those 5 roles, I think you're very well covered to have a successful project. Obviously, you can change the composition depending on how many use cases you're doing that are requiring machine learning versus how many are requiring RPA. If you want to accelerate things, you might have more developers. If you're just starting, then you don't need a huge team.
Right. And those 3 skill sets that you spoke about, they come
Yes.
from an external supplier typically?
So there's 3 ways you can go about that. So method 1 is to train people internally. You may have people who are interested in being involved in the program, and they will go on Automation Academy. All our customers have access to all of the courses. It comes at no extra cost. And so that's one approach. The second approach is to go out to one of our many excellent partners. Many of them are here today, the likes of Capgemini, Deloitte, Accenture, EY, etc. And so those teams, those consultancy firms, have a huge bench, hundreds of people trained up in these tools, and so you can get them to help out. And then the third option, and this does happen as well, is people say, I don't want to use an advisory firm, and I don't want to build my own resources. Can you help? In which case, there are models where we can support as well. And the most common is to have a hybrid of this. So you would typically start with a partner, with a consultancy like Capgemini coming in, and then and maybe WorkFusion helping at the same time. And then over time, WorkFusion would leave the project when you no longer need us. Capgemini might leave the project, and eventually your own staff, once you've got a center of excellence in place, would take over all the development. And so if you look at customers like Standard Bank, they have this huge center of excellence, and they're automating a vast number of processes across their business, and have already achieved a huge amount. So it depends what stage you're at as well, and how comfortable you are with doing it in-house versus how much external help you need.
Just one more. The role for ML engineer should probably not be so predominant if the system is already choosing the right algorithms, I believe.
So I think it's very important to understand what a machine learning engineer is. It's a guy or a girl who who's like an RPA developer plus, who can run AutoML, analyze the results produced by the machine learning model, push it into a business process, right? Replace a fully manual task with a cognitive bot, and do some post-processing. So post-processing is, imagine you have a document coming in, a loan document, and it says, the total amount of the loan is 101.2, right? And the machine learning model is going to successfully extract this data. But your backend system doesn't recognize points. It only recognizes commas, right? So if you try to push in 101.2 in there, it's going to be an error, which you don't want in your fully automated end-to-end process, right? So you can, with WorkFusion, very simply implement some logic so that the successful data produced by your machine learning model is consumable by the downstream system, right? That would be the job of a machine learning engineer, to do what we call post-processing. Imagine that actually what you put into your system is not the loan amount, but it's the loan amount divided by the number of years, which is also something which is on the document that the software has also successfully captured. So what you do is that you do post-processing, and you divide the total amount of the loan divided by the years, and that's what the software will receive as input data, right? So this is the role of a machine learning engineer. No data science skills, but an RPA dev plus role. And it's useful to have those guys, because they can run AutoML, analyze the results of a machine learning model, and then push it into a business process in a process-friendly way, so that it indeed enables the end-to-end I think one thing important to mention is that you don't need those people on the full duration of a project, because if there is no machine learning model, you don't need an MLE, right? So what our clients do is that they mutualize the resources across different deployments, right? Because once process A is going to be tagging and you don't have anything to do, maybe the process before that is at the stage where MLE is involved, and when that process is finished, so you can run successive deployments with a single role.
Is he also required to take care of underfitting or overfitting of the models?
So the software does this, but if you want to, if you want to have an extra pair of eye, if you want to tweak the model, if you want to add features, you can use the ML SDK to do this as an MLE or as a real data scientist. But that's a business decision to invest time here or not.
Yeah, and just one more last one. That ties back to the question that skills-based. On the operations side, who are actually going to be the tagging, what's the general skill set that is recommended?
Nothing.
Absolutely nothing, just
2 hours of training with the delivery team to understand the logic, but
If
The
that.
UI and
Yeah, I
the
think
tool itself.
I think the key point here is that WorkFusion manual tasks are supposed to be a seamless transition from their day job today. So they would, as per the example I gave in my presentation, instead of sitting with an Excel spreadsheet and another application, they're doing everything on that manual task. That's it. They log in via their browser. As long as they know what they need to do, what the fields are, then there's no training at all.
okay. Thank you.
yeah.
Hi, my question is around the training data set. If I have 350 documents from which 100 fields have to be extracted from each one of them, and every one of them is different, what's the ratio of training data set I have to create? Because that's a lot of manual work that we need to create. And at the end of that exercise, we might have created that data set already. So typically, I have a use case where I have a lot of contract documents where they need data to be extracted. But when I say that you have to deploy some resources to do this training data set extraction, it doesn't sell well. So what would be your advice?
So could you just repeat the first? It's 350
Documents.
is the training set,
No, it's just plain contract documents.
right?
Say it's a legal document or
Yeah.
any property document. And we want to extract, say, 100 sets of data fields from each of them. Because the contract is different for every client or every property, there will be a different variance of each of them. So what is the ratio of training data set? When do we say it's enough to create 20 documents for this kind of data set? Or do we have to train all of the 350, which means we would have done the exercise by then?
Yeah, so the most important part would be like all those 100 fields, are they available in all those 350 documents? That's the first and foremost thing, because 100 fields is quite a big number, and for like a data set of 350 documents. But if all of those 100 fields are available, then probably we can reach, 75% or 70, 80% of the training with that. But, the actual figures can be arrived only after seeing the data. But at least, are you sure like you have 100 fields in all of those documents?
We wouldn't know that, right? Unless somebody manually reads the documents, because that's the problem we have.
So I think, the question is, how can we best absorb that training investment in a way? So you have two ways with which you can train WorkFusion. You can train in production or you can train outside of production. Training in production has a benefit, which is people do what they're supposed to do, right? But actually the software is looking at what they do and is learning. The downside of that approach is you need to automate the end-to-end process before that can happen, right? So that you're in production, but people are training the software in production. The second approach is you do sprints, which are simultaneous while you develop the RPA and the manual work automation. And at the same time, outside of production too, you ask people to train the software with 350 historical documents, right? What we say is that, of course, machine learning principle is quite simple. The more you train, the better you get results, right? But 350 is, provided it's representative data with, every field being present on every document so that you know you have indeed 350 examples for every field. 350 sounds like a reasonable number. And then what you're going to do is probably assess the time it would take for people to do this and put this into your ROI. Because yes, it's an investment, maybe a few days of work for 2-3 people to train, to tag 350 documents on 100 fields, which is quite a large number. But at the same time, if after 3-4 weeks, that amount of time that people spend doing it fully manually can be drastically reduced through machine learning, the investment is worth it, right? So, because how much time does it take for people to look through multi-page document and find 100 fields today? Probably dozens of minutes per document, right? So it's really important that the business understands that, yes, if you do it outside of production, there is an investment, but that investment is going to pay off in days or weeks, not in months. And the drop in work is going to be very substantial quite quickly. So that's the way you convince a business to invest. Because otherwise, if you just tell them you need to tag and they don't see, you know, the impact, indeed, it's very difficult to pull people out of their daily job and say, please do training on the side.
I think if you're worried, Adrian's first approach of doing it in production is the answer, because then you've already delivered some benefit with the RPA, OCR, other tools. So you're already, say, reducing the amount of effort by 50%, let's say. And then the bit that you're worried about, the tagging, well, today they have to extract that information, right? Otherwise you wouldn't be looking to automate it. So when you do it in production, they just do their work as they do it today. It just so happens to happen through the WorkFusion workflow rather than whatever tool they used to use before. So if they used to read it on their PDF reader, now they're reading it on WorkFusion. And then when they complete the task manually, because they still have to do their day job, when they complete the task manually, that's feeding back into WorkFusion. So you're getting immediate return on investment on the other bits you automated. You're not actually hurting them at all or distracting them at all from their day job. They're just doing their day job on WorkFusion. And then once WorkFusion is ready to automate it, it will tell you it's ready and it says automation available. So that approach of having the software observe people in production doing their day-to-day work is the best way, I think, of getting around those cases where you're a bit worried about the impact.
Thank you.
Yeah.
One at the back over there.
Hi. Just wanted to touch on sort of a theme that's been coming out from some of these questions and from the presentation. And it's around sort of return on investment, prioritization, and value. I guess in businesses, you would either have people sort of solely focusing on one process or one type of repetitive task. And I guess the sort of the measurement there becomes a little bit easier because you can do that on a full-time employee basis. But in your experience, how have you sort of measured the sort of the benefit in putting these things in place without going down a timesheet type approach? Like how do you measure the time, the effort, and the cost that a process would take, and therefore then add that into your ROI calculation?
Yeah, so the methodology is very similar to how you would do this with any process improvement or RPA initiative, and it is a case of looking at average handling times, FTEs, and then looking at the efficiency you're going to deliver over time with the different components of the tool. So with RPA, it's each step of the process you're able to automate with RPA is 100%, right? You're automating the entirety of that task. And then looking at the scenarios and volumes that flow through that process and the saving you deliver there. When it comes to machine learning, as we've just discussed, the benefits change over time, can potentially change over time. And so we're looking at, as we discussed in our presentation this morning, setting some success criteria, which might be around accuracy of the model, extraction rate, and then straight through processing, which is how much of the volume going through this process is going to be completed entirely without human involvement, and using that to drive your business case. Quite often, customers want to be very conservative when it comes with machine learning and set expectations low. But again, the great thing about supervised machine learning is if we give good data and we can provide the required volumes of training data, we can often exceed expectations and deliver much more benefit. One of the other interesting components, and we touched on this in the previous question, was that we can stand up an end-to-end process very quickly using the different components that we've discussed, and it's very similar to the use case that I mentioned earlier with the payment screening. It gives the human user a UI that's much more intuitive, much quicker, and deliver benefits that way as well, simultaneously to training the machine learning model. But the methodology and approach is the same.
But if I could add a few other things on FTE estimation. So as you said, if it's a whole role, you know up front it's 1 FTE. If you are not sure, then there's a few different estimation approaches you can use. So one approach, and it's very crude, but then you can apply a risk factor to your business case, is to guesstimate or ask the SMEs how much of your day is spent doing this process. And in some teams, they might only do 5 processes, so they can say, well, I spend 20% of my time doing it, then you know it's 20% of an FTE. When you don't have that information, another approach, which is, I think, more precise, but you perhaps depends how detailed you want to be, is to actually measure how long it takes them to process one document. And if you do that 10 times, you get a relatively good understanding of how long it takes them to process one transaction, one document, one email, end to end. Once you know how long it's taking them, you can multiply by the number of transactions in that process. So if it takes them an hour to do something end to end, and it's all time they were sitting at their computer working on it, and that's a rough average, you've done it 10 times and it always took about an hour, you can then say, well, there's 70,000 of these transactions a year, so it will save 70,000 hours. And then if you go to HR, they'll tell you there will usually be an official number of hours that people work once you discount for holiday, sick leave, lunch breaks, training. There's usually like an official figure you can get from HR or finance, because they have to do these estimations when they're looking at budgeting and things. And then if you've got that estimation, you've got an estimate of how long it takes, and you've got an estimate of volumes, you can actually get quite a precise figure.
And that's the baseline. But the actual impact you'll get through analytics in WorkFusion. Because through analytics, you'll know exactly how much time it took for people to work on the platform, which is everything they should be doing. And you'll know this worker by worker, day by day. So, calculating the ROI starts to be very precise. If you have a baseline and you have WorkFusion analytics giving you the results, it's solid math.
And just to add to, just a couple of more angles to the ROI part. Depending on the use case for which you have gone for automation, suppose if you have increased the accuracy and you have AML use case as was presented, and you could save, some millions of dollars for your company, so that adds to it. The second would be like you are increasing the capacity, because now you have an automated process which you can run 3 times a day without adding. So for all adjustments for your peak volumes, so those things are, that you will realize over time if you are going for a growth. So everything can be factored in.
Yeah. But you saying that's triggered another thought, which is you don't just want to be looking at FTEs. A lot of this isn't about let's reduce the team size and deliver savings that way. Cost reduction is sometimes an objective, but often it's about let's improve service. So one of the customers I've been working on, one of the big music streaming companies, for them it's about they want to be able to deliver more work with the same team, and they want to improve their service to customers. And there's other ways you would measure those benefits. It's also in some processes about reducing the error rate. Where you look at the process, and let's say it's a compliance process, you don't want errors in that, because the regulator will come for you if you're making a payment you shouldn't be making, for example. So there are a range of other benefits on top of FTE that you can also quantify and be factoring into a good all-round business case.
I think there was a question here, yeah.
So in terms of the ML, we've seen a lot of sort of document classification and natural language sort of solutions. Do you have stuff built in for sort of maybe image classification or image tagging or speech-to-text type ML problems? Or is it more focused on the language document classification type stuff?
So I would say if you think about where you can apply AI with WorkFusion, so first of all, we do it in the back office work, right? Middle and back office work. We're not going to automate the work of lawyers and doctors and very high-end expert, jobs. When you look at those middle and back office work, we roughly categorize what we call cognitive work or judgment-based work, where you need AI, in 3 main categories. Reconciliation, you have 2 data sets, you have a prescription and a pathology, and you just need to make sure it makes sense, right? You have a transaction where it's about 12 Mercedes, and the same transaction is described as 12 cars, right? As a human, you know it's the same, right? So that's the type of job that you can automate through machine learning with WorkFusion out of the box. Second job is classification. So classifying documents or classifying emails or classifying data. So, I have a multiple page PDF coming in, and I need to find the hospital bill and the exit proof that I left the hospital, because I'm an insurer, and that's the 2 documents I'm looking at when I process this process, right? So what I do as a human is I scroll through my multiple page PDF and I look for pages and I classify them. No, no, yes, no, no, yes. So that type of work you can automate out of the box with WorkFusion and AI. The third type of task is, and on this task, it's the same with emails. I read an email and I have 15 teams I could forward it to, right? I just classify it. I read, I see something, and I say, oh, it's a change in the proof of address. So I need to change it to the policy administration team, whatever. The third major type of task is data extraction. I have unstructured documents coming in. It's always the same data, but it's never the same format. How can I use machine learning to identify patterns, and just like a human would do with a brain and a pair of eyes, look at the document and extract the right data at the right place. So those are the 3 main ones. We do have customers who apply us to do, I would say, custom AI with WorkFusion in terms of, sometimes some image recognition work, or some advanced classification or sentiment analysis and so on. But this is not the core focus of the platform, because people in the back office, they don't spend the time doing sentiment analysis. That's not just the back office work, right? So you could use a platform to do that, but that would be more custom development that you would do, involving data scientists or another tool with APIs connection. The out-of-the-box capabilities and the everyday AI capabilities we bring is really for the back office and middle office work.
And I think just to add to that and bring it back to the solutioning piece, it's all about understanding the business problem and then applying the right technology to solve that business problem. And quite often we have customers come to us and say, hey, I need natural language processing and sentiment analysis so I can classify emails. Actually, you don't often pass the entire context of the email to understand what it's about. There's lots of different techniques that we can apply with classification models that don't necessarily need to have sentiment analysis in them, okay? And it's the same with large multi-page documents. I was at a customer in Belgium recently, and they were saying to me, hey, we've got 500-page documents, and we need to be able to extract data from all of the, from this big document. When actually you break the problem down, there's only 5 or 6 key pages in that document that they need. The rest of it is just legal jargon that the operations guy doesn't read. We don't need to understand the legal terms. We actually need to classify which pages are which, and then extract the key information, which actually narrowed down to less than 50 fields across those different pages. So this is what solutioning is all about. The customer has a problem but may have limited understanding of technology. We need to be the bridge between the business and the technology to break that solution down into appropriate chunks and apply the right technology to solve the problem. And as Adrian said, where these problems are real and we do need other capabilities, WorkFusion is able to integrate with other tools, and we're also able to do custom machine learning to solve those problems too. Okay. Any more questions? I think we've got time for just one more. There's one at the back.
Just a quick question in terms of OCR. With OCR, obviously you've already got a built-in OCR engine which is there, and it's got certain feature gaps, like capturing handwriting or even I guess, radio buttons and things like that. So what's the roadmap around addressing those?
So it's a good question. So there was no use when we built the platform. There was no use in reinventing the wheel, right? So we're using an OCR tool that we see as a good one to digitize pages. So first of all, it's very important to understand that what we call OCR is, all respect due, but pretty stupid work. It's translating a number one on an image into a digital number one, right? That's all we call OCR. It works very well, right? We have enhanced it with our own machine learning capabilities so that we have a layer on top of OCR to learn from the classic OCR mistakes. An 8, confused with a B, an I confused with a 1, And then on top of this first layer, we have everyday AI to not only OCR document, but then interpret the data and extract it, right? That's all we talked about. Handwritten is something that the industry is working on. We're not going to develop, the same way we didn't develop our own OCR tool, we're not going to develop our own OCR tool for handwriting. Today, handwriting doesn't work. I mean, that's an industry problem, and people that say they have good result are probably lying to you, because we all write like pigs. I mean, that's the reality, and me, starting with me. So it's a very complex problem. Probably it will be solved one day. I'm not a technical expert, so I would be, I wouldn't be able to say when, but definitely when it is solved, we will embed it the same way we embed OCR. What we see is, when you look at the pyramid of the organizations, there is already so much, there's already so much you can do without it, but we don't see this as first of all, it's not available from a tech perspective, and B, we don't see this as a blocker to roll out intelligent automation at our clients. More and more, our clients are, processing machine type, documents. The handwriting part is just fading away in our lives. I mean, how many times per day do we pick up a pen?
Well, it depends on the use case, because if your use case is expected to capture signatures,
so
I think pretty much those.
So with WorkFusion, you can recognize if there is a signature on the document. We wouldn't be able to compare it with a real signature, but you're able to recognize if there is handwriting on the document and if that handwriting is a signature, but it stops here. But the other way you could imagine, you have a very handwriting heavy process at some point. The way you could do that is automate it and have a fully manual task where people just type what they see, right? But if they would do so in a WorkFusion end-to-end workflow, and that's almost the only thing they would be doing. So if there is tremendous value to automate this process with intelligent automation, you could still do it, but it would remain a fully manual step at this stage.
Adrian, if I could just add to that. So we have done use cases where, as Adrian mentioned, the signature is a very important part. That's something we have actually implemented. So you're able to categorize whether or not there's a signature, use that signature, and continue the rest of the process. In terms of the roadmap in general, there was a session yesterday around that roadmap. So if you weren't able to see it, I really recommend watching the video. We've also got people from our product team here, so if you want an introduction, we can introduce them. I also recommend looking at our tech radar. So we are constantly monitoring with our research team the latest developments in AI and the latest developments that are important to business operations. And we prioritize those that we think are going to have the most value on companies. So yesterday you heard a little bit about how differential privacy is something that we're bringing to the market. There are other features of that same importance and scale that we're also introducing in over the next few years.
I think time is up as per the timer. Many thanks for your time. If you have more questions, we'll be around, so don't hesitate. And I guess off to the next session.